Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the first episode of the Aurora Smedley podcast, where I talk about what the world needs to hear. In today's episode, I'm going to be talking about the creative process and living a creative life more generally. So, a few months ago, I had a friend talk to me about finding his creative sound, his musical sound. And he said that he was having difficulty finding what his sound was. So this episode is about that. How can you find your sound? And on a more general level, how can you find your life and live your life according to your terms? So a little bit about myself. I did my undergraduate in geophysics and then hiked 2,000 miles along the Pacific Crest Trail, became a professional musician in China, released my first album in the United States, was featured on NPR, KEXP, and I did all of this without having any family members or any peers of mine who had done anything similar in any respect. So I'm going to be speaking with you now about how to live creatively and to create your artistic work from a place of this kind of authenticity. So the first thing to know in finding your creative voice is understanding that your creative voice is not something to be found. Your creative voice is always within you, and you need to simply actually listen to it and actually be able to access it by connecting with it directly. So most people think that your creative voice is something that you develop, but what you're actually developing is your connection to the voice that you already have. As you become more connected to your own creative voice, this is when people will find the art that you create more compelling, and this is when your life will feel that it is more authentic, that it is more magical, that it is more true to you. So in essence, the challenge is not how do I find my voice, but rather how do I listen to the voice that I already have? How do I maintain trust in the present moment as who I am now? And how can I express who I am now to the greatest extent of my ability? So this is another thing to take note of, is that your creative voice is something that changes over time because you are changing. You are never going to be the same person from day to day. We are spiritual, constantly evolving beings. And so every single day that you wake up in the morning, you're going to be a different person. And what your creative voice looks like is going to be different as well. So in essence, the practice is finding a way to connect to your creative voice now in the moment as you are now in order to express that fully. In your artistry, that's going to look like connecting to the sound that speaks to you right now. And that sound may or may not have anything to do with the sound that you used to be connected with. In your life, this would also look like, okay, the things that you are drawn to now may have nothing to do with what you were before. So I'm going to speak now on something that generally gets a bad rap, but I think is actually critical to understanding creative evolution and personal evolution. And this is the idea of the phase. So a lot of times you'll hear people say, oh, she's just going through a phase, or he is just going through a phase. And problem with this is that we are making the assumption that since a situation is temporary, it is actually not extremely valuable for the development of the person. So just like adolescence is a phase, or childhood is a phase, or adulthood is a phase. These are all inherently temporary. However, they are all crucial to our personal development. So what I'm saying here is that anytime that you go through a quote unquote phase, this is something that is likely critical to your personal evolution. So I can say this for myself. For example, as a Pacific Crest Trail hiker, I know some people that go and they hike the Pacific Crest Trail. It's 2,600 miles. And then they go back and do it the next year. And then the next year they go and hike another trail. And the next year they go and hike another trail. And they keep doing this essentially for the rest of their life. Long term, they are long-term hikers. However, for the majority of us, a lot of us go and hike the trail, and then we return back to society and figure out how to incorporate that experience into our life. So what I'm saying is that essentially, what you do short term can still have a massive impact on your life moving forward. And so I'm going to emphasize the importance of the phase, the importance of the temporary, because everything is temporary, in fact. So as you go through your creative journey, you're going to find that you go through a series of multiple different phases that from the external perspective might not make sense, that some people might disvalue because it is a quote unquote phase. However, the fact that it is a phase does not devalue it as an essential part of your journey. So the next thing that I want to touch on is listening to the small little voice in your head. So as I already said, everybody has a creative voice. Everybody has that internal voice that they could be connecting to, but the majority of people are not connecting to that voice, not even necessarily because they don't hear it, but because they don't act on it. Why do we not take action on our internal creative voice? The reason why is because it is typically running against societal norms and standards. We are afraid of being judged. We are afraid of doing the thing because we might risk our well-being, our life, our financial world. Obviously, all of these things are important. However, when we completely disregard our internal voice out of fear of others' perceptions or potential negative outcomes, we are actually limiting ourselves from being exposed to all of what we are. You see, the tiny little voice that you have in your head is not just a random thing. That is a transmission from the universe, which is asking for you to grow as a person and as a soul. So when you ignore that voice in your head, you're ignoring your soul's growth and your soul's trajectory. So basically, how can we learn to access this tiny little voice in our head and begin to respect it more and actually do it more? One way that you can begin to access this voice in your head is ask a question, and as you get your very first answer to that question, that is the answer to the question. So, for example, what would you do if you had $10 million in the bank and didn't have to go to work? All of your expenses were taken care of, and you could not invest the money in any kind of investment other than yourself and your personal enjoyment. Oh, and you can't spend the money on anybody else. Okay, so I'm going to give you 5 seconds to think about that. And when you think about that, you're going to have a one thing that, or a couple small things that are going to pop into your head. And I want you to take note of that and write it down. Those things that popped into your head are likely things that are critical for your soul's development. So now that you know this little thing that is calling to you, now let's talk about our resistance to that. So You see, actually knowing what we want is typically not the problem for people. The problem is actually listening to ourselves and thinking that it's possible. You see, most people are quote unquote realistic. But when you are realistic, what it means is that you are letting reality control you. You are letting reality show you what is possible rather than you decide what's possible and let reality shift to match that. When you are being realistic, you are letting reality control you rather than that you control reality. All of external reality was originally an idea in someone's head, and what we consider realistic in today's day and age is actually what was extremely unrealistic even 50 years ago. If somebody discussed the internet 50 years ago, we would see it as absolute lunacy. If somebody discussed an iPhone 50 years ago, we would see it as absolute idiocy. If somebody discussed SpaceX or even flying to the moon 100 years ago, we would say that that person was crazy. So my question for you is, if somebody can fly to the moon, if somebody can invent the cell phone, then why can you not accomplish your dreams? All of your dreams that you say are unrealistic because society says so, because quote unquote reality says so. But in order to actually influence the outcomes of reality, you need to believe it so hard that reality will reshape itself around you and your belief. And that is called leadership. So what I'm saying is that the limitation to our development circles around our belief. As you bring more belief, more certainty, more alliance with the outcome that you want, the more that is going to naturally come into your reality. As you continue this process of listening to your inner voice and following that inner voice, you will find that your life naturally takes shape in a way that is magical beyond your wildest dreams. This is the essence of what living creatively is, and this is in essence how to find your creative voice. And I will remind you that the act of living your life is a creative act. So with that, I look forward to seeing you next week in the next episode of this podcast.